What's up? My name is Lamb, back at it again with another great video. On today's video, I will be reading Chapter 2 of Candace Owens' Blackout, How Black America Can Make Its Second Escape from the Democrat Plantation. I got a lot of views on the first chapter reading. What I did not get was a lot of likes, shares, and subscribes, so if you could please do so, I would really appreciate it. This is Chapter 2 on Family. The last few years have brought an unforeseen spread of conservatism in the West. The 2016 vote for Brexit, the British exit from the European Union, shocked every mainstream pundit and poll worldwide that had bet against it. After 43 years of the United Kingdom's forfeiting its sovereignty to bureaucrats in Brussels, British citizens had had enough. Despite being warned that their departure might lead to their economic demise, the United Kingdom voted to leave. Similarly, on the other side of the Atlantic, Donald Trump's defeat of President hopeful Hillary Clinton, a Washington insider who was glorified by the press, sent shockwaves throughout the world. For the mainstream media characters who had grown used to reporting what should happen rather than what actually could happen, these binary political earthquakes could mean only one thing: widespread disobedience. Voters had disobeyed the mainstream narrative. In response, left-wing journalists unused to having their authority questioned, began printing articles claiming that people were becoming radicalized by the internet. This, of course, is a laughed out loud assertion, born of journalists' anxiety that they were ceding influence to independent voices. And indeed they are. On any given day, CNN, the largest left-wing cable news station in America, averages 706,000 viewers. When the world depended upon television as a primary source of information, that may have been considered a large reach. But technology has transformed our circumstances. Today, the world prefers to communicate online. And so, although leftists dominate the TV market, conservatives are winning the internet. As an example, according to Twitter analytics, just one solitary tweet that I send reaches an average of 2.5 million people. This means that I am able to dwarf all of CNN's viewership with a tweet, and I'm far from the only person with that capability. Realizing that none of their ideas were being presented across the mainstream networks, conservatives began mining the wild west of the early social media age and found success. Social media then represented an existential threat to the social media then represents an existential threat to the left-wing establishment, which is why they have begun pressuring social media companies to both ban and limit the reach of conservative accounts. This explains why, in a 2008 opinion piece, the New York Times issued the rather extraordinary claim that jihadists and right-wing extremists use remarkably similar social media strategies. In December of that same year, the Daily Beast published an article titled "How YouTube Built a Radicalization Machine for the Right." Thousands upon thousands of articles were written conveying the same sentiment. The internet was suddenly a problem. Of course, what was really happening was that the left's majority coverage, Democrat journalists outnumber Republicans 4-1, was now made to compete with the right in getting out information. With a swell of independent voices rising, they were simply ill-prepared to have their narratives challenged. Unsurprisingly, there was no feverish claims of internet radicalization until America voted for Donald Trump. Despite the mainstream media spending every hour portraying him as a racist, sexist monster, when it came time, America ignored their smears and picked him to lead the nation. The journalists were correct to blame our collective disobedience on the internet. We disobeyed because we were able to determine independently that the media was attempting to skew the election against him, and they were using extravagant claims of racism to do so. I was one such person who was radicalized on the internet during the time, meaning that I too learned the truth about the media's distortions and lies. Armed with nothing more than a hunch that the media's insistence of racial unrest was suspicious, I turned to the internet to investigate some varied opinions on the mainstream's opinions that a Donald Trump presidency would inspire a white supremacist uprising. My radicalization. When I first became curious about conservative perspectives, I began searching YouTube for black conservatives, people I had previously dismissed as Uncle Toms and race traders. At the time of my searching, there was an ongoing mainstream narrative about the topic of police brutality. I decided to start here. I came across a clip of Larry Elder, a black radio show host, author, former attorney, and self professed libertarian. Elder had dedicated decades to exposing the hypocrisies of the left, with books like What's Race Got to Do with It. He has developed expert analysis on the issues crippling black Americans today. In the now viral clip, Elder sets Edler sits across from liberal host Dave Rubin, now a dear friend of mine, for our interview on his web show, The Rubin Report, with the amiable intent of acknowledging systemic issues of oppression facing black America. Rubin makes the fatal mistake of suggesting that police brutality is a blatant example of racism, and with sharpshooting statistical accuracy, Elder responds with a total annihilation of the liberal narrative. 965 people were shot by cops last year. 4% of them were white cops shooting unarmed blacks. In Chicago in 2011, 21 people were shot and killed by cops. In 2015, there were 7. In Chicago, which is about one third black, one third white, and one third Hispanic, 70% of homicides are black on black. About 40 per month, almost 500 last year in Chicago. And about 75% of them are unsolved. Where's the Black Lives Matter on that? The idea that a racist white cop shooting unarmed black people is a peril to the black people is complete and total BS. I knew that I had witnessed I knew that I had just witnessed an intellectual beatdown and that Dave Rubin wasn't the only victim. In the span of 15 seconds, Eltler had knocked me into the reality that many of the issues. Eltler had knocked me into the reality that many of the issues I had accepted to be meaningful on the basis of excessive media coverage were of very little substance. With humility, Rubin then asked Larry what his opinion was on issues facing black America. The biggest burden that black people have, in my opinion, is the percentage of blacks, 75% of them, that are raised without fathers. And that has every other social negative consequence connected to it. Crime, not being able to compete economically in the country, being more likely to be arrested, that's the number one problem facing the black community. Rubin quickly beginning to see the light as Edler, Elder, as Elder, what could be done to tackle that problem, to which Elder boldly declared, reverse the welfare state. In 1890 to 1900, you look at the Senate's reports, a black person, believed it or not, was more likely to be born to a nuclear intact family than a white kid. Even during slavery, a black kid was more likely to be born under a roof with his biological mother and biological father than today. Larry's declaration that even during the traumatic periods of slavery and segregation, black families were more intact than they are today stunned me. I wanted to learn more. The destruction of the family unit used to be considered a moral abomination, so much so that it became the cornerstone of the abolishment movement, or a cornerstone of the abolitionist movement. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, widely regarded as one of the most effective tools in shifting the attitudes of Northern whites against slavery, is a 250 plus page lament of slavery's efforts on the black family. Uncle Tom's Cabinet is a chilling illustration of the father who learns that he will be sold away from his wife and children, and a mother who discovers that she will be separated from her only living child. The cultural impact of the book cannot be overstated. Families gathered together after dinner to read the controversial tone that pulled back the veil on the country's most heinous institution. Readers in the northern United States as well as Europe became outraged by and sympathetic to the atrocities detailed by Stubb. Of course, the formal ending of the practice of slavery became monumental in the legitimizing of black families across America. Terry Hunter, a history professor at Princeton University and author of "To Joy My Freedom: Southern Black Women's Lives and Labors After the Civil War," spoke about this revolution in a 2010 interview with NPR. After the Civil War, you see marriage being one of the first civil rights that African Americans are able to exercise, she explained. And they do that with a great deal of enthusiasm to the point of overwhelming the Union Army, making it difficult for them to handle the numbers of people trying to get married. Additionally, millions of former slaves conducted desperate long distance searches to reconnect with family members who had been sold away or otherwise displaced by the war. The result was the formation of committed maintenance of millions of black families. In many regards, the preservation of the family became greater than the preservation of self, a sentiment shared by men and women of all races throughout history. How is it possible then that some 100 years after slavery, the greater rupture of the black family began? If not every slavery if not even slavery or Jim Crow laws could break down the black family, if not even the inhumanity of being deemed three-fifths of a person or being granted just a fraction of the rights of others was capable of tearing them apart, what ultimately did? The Democrat Party has a long history of racism, but few can claim as much credit for damaging the black community as the late President Lyndon B. Johnson. Robert Caro's definitive biography of LBJ, Master of the Senate, talks about his common use of word, the N word, not in singular use, but frequently and repeatedly. While in Congress, Johnson was an extremely conscientious member of the Southern Bloc, the Democrat controlled voting group that was notoriously committed to blocking the progression of civil rights. In fact, during Johnson's first 20 years in the U.S. Senate, he voted down every single civil rights measures that made the floor. Despite his track record, Johnson is hailed as a hero because it was his presidential inking of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that granted black Americans equal standing in the eyes of the law with whites. But just how does Johnson's signature of his act of freedom reconcile with his earlier voting record? Use of racist terminology as well as his well documented discriminatory treatment of blacks around him. After decades of working against blacks, had Johnson experienced a sudden epiphany? There is a quote that is attributed to LBJ in Ronald Kessler's book Inside the White House that may be spurious. We shall never know as it was not verbally recorded, where LBJ allegedly said to two governors, "I'll have those N-words voting Democrat for the next 200 years." His reference, according to Kessler, was not to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 nor to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but instead to the launch of the Great Society program, the method by which the Democrat Party would marry black America to the government via welfare. LBJ's Great Society initiatives were a deliberate attack on the black family unit, levied through the empowerment of the poor black woman and the emasculation and ultimate obviation of the black man. Johnson's promise to eradicate poverty in all of America was fully embraced by struggling blacks, so much that they did not object to the rules that rendered poor mothers ineligible for benefits when an able-bodied male was present. Black women were instead encouraged by the government to raise their children alone. Emboldened by the appeal of free government money, many of the pro-family advancements made by a post-slavery black community were quickly rolled back. As some black women discovered that the government could act as a provider for the families, they often neglected to hold black men accountable to their children, which over time can lead to choosing less suitable partners for marriage and fatherhood. Government assistance also provides no incentive to black men to step up. This was the first major indentation that the government made upon black culture. Today, hearing black hip hop artists rap and sing about their various baby mamas is considered culturally normative. There is a lot of data freely available on the decline of black America between the initiation of the Great Society and the current day, but one statistic is startling. According to the Statistical Abstract of the United States, in 1963, 72% of non white families were married and together. By 2017, that data was almost exactly reversed. Only 27% of black households were married a staggering 45% dropped over the period. In comparison, the white population went from 89% married and together in 1963 down to 51% in 2007, a 38% comparative drop. Policies that were purported to empower Black America actually resulted in the greatest family breakdown across all demographics. Another telling area of breakdown is the number of unmarried men there are in the black community. In the 1960 census, approximately 24.4% of white men were unmarried aged 15 and over. The comparable data within the black community was 29.6%, an approximate 5% difference. Compare this with current rates of unmarried men today. In 2017, 33.1% of white men were unmarried, while unmarried black men had risen to a staggering 51.9%, a variation of 18.8%, or in other words, a variation jump of 362%. It is a correct assumption that these single men are not all committing themselves to lives of virtuous chastity. The majority go through what is now a normalized pattern of unmarried sexual relations with a high probability of fatherhood, exceptional rates of father absence can go a long way in terms of explaining racial disparities. What the Great Society program proved was that in the absence of fathers, children will pursue that missing paternity elsewhere, and elsewhere tends to be the streets, where an easy path to crime and eventually prison awaits. Larry Elder was correct then to point to father absence as the greatest index of predictive failure. According to the independent, nonpartisan bookings institution, children raised by single mothers are more likely to fare worse on a number of dimensions, including their school achievements, their social and emotional development, their health, and their success in the labor market. They are at great risk of parental abuse and neglect, especially from live in boyfriends who are not their biological fathers, more likely to become teen parents, and less likely to graduate from high school or college. What is more, the tendency of black children raised in fatherless homes to perpetuate the environments into which they were born puts continued pressure on the government to support future generations of fatherless offspring. In the generation since the implementation of Johnson's Great Society, the epidemic of fatherless homes has produced a modernized black family dynamic that functions nothing like the model sought by early 20th century blacks. The results have been exactly as dramatic as Johnson and his Democrat cronies could have dreamed. When we consider where black America is today versus before the initiation of the Great Society reforms, it's suddenly much easier to reconcile LBJ's racism. What better way to connive an entire ethnic group into believing that you are for them than through the enact of pieces of legislation that will guarantee their votes for the next 200 years? LBJ, arguably one of the greatest politicians of the 20th century America, both convinced black America that he was the greatest savior and ensured that they would forever be in need of saving. Black America was both freed and enslaved again within one presidency. And in fact, the policies that were purported to empower Black America and bridge the wealth divide between whites and blacks have only exacerbated that divide, with the added benefit of placing a tremendous strain on our national treasury. Welfare is the largest expenditure in the federal budget, more than 1 trillion yearly, with absolutely no empirical points of success that warrant its continued existence. What if I took that kind of welfare policy and implemented it in your family? Wrote K. Coles James, president of the Heritage Foundation. If I said to your son, sweetie, you don't have to work, I'll take care of everything. And if I said to your daughters, sugar, go ahead and have as many babies as you want, I'll give you more money to take care of them. What do you think your family would be like in 20 years? I'll tell you. Your sons would be living at home and not working, your daughters would be having kids out of wedlock, and your family would be a whole lot poorer. It surprises me that the issue of welfare reform has been drawn across party lines when politicians on both sides of the aisle have justifiably critiqued the modern social safety net and its tendency to keep blacks tight within its perimeters. Ronald Reagan was roundly lambasted for his depiction of the welfare queen, a woman who was said to have used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veteran benefits for 4 non-essential deceased veteran husbands, and a woman whose tax-free cash income alone has not has been running 150,000 a year, and who, for better or worse, was said to represent the vast majority of urban red black women on welfare. Despite criticism, Reagan was telling the truth. Welfarism wreaks undue havoc upon any given society by enabling irresponsible behavior from both men and women. Those who wish to dismiss that truth as the racist rantings of a now deceased staunchly conservative Republican president would do well to remember that its sentiments were also echoed by former President Barack Obama, our liberal first black president. In an impassioned 2008 Father's Day speech, Obama made clear the impact that single parent homes, a direct result of the welfare state, were having upon black children. Of all the rocks upon which we built our lives, we are reminded today that family is the most important, and we are all called to recognize and honor how critical every father is to that foundation. They are teachers and coaches, they are mentors and role models, they are examples of success and the men who constantly push us towards it. But if we are honest with ourselves, we'll admit that what too many fathers are missing also are is missing from too many lives and too many homes. They have abandoned their responsibilities, acting like boys instead of men, and the foundations of our families are weaker because of it. You and I know how you and I know how true this is in the African American community. We know that more than half of all black children live in single parent households, a number that has doubled since we were children. We we know the statistics that children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit a crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 22 times more likely to end up in prison. They are more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundation of our community are weaker because of it. In the 12 years since Obama delivered that moving speech, our society seems to be barreled far further away from its lessons. The general shifting of American culture towards liberal ideologies has loosened the stigma of out of wedlock childbirth among all races. We are engaged in a cultural war, one that is being waged between those who uphold the traditional values responsible for our country's achievement and those pushing for an updated, faux progressive, radical destructive change. I have often said that no society can survive without strong men. Radical feminists regularly insinuate that accepting the empirical evidence that children fare better with their fathers in the home suggests that women ought to remain in abusive relationships if they become pregnant. This is a twisted neoliberal assessment that works to devalue the presence of men through the argument of an extreme. Of course, no woman or man for that matter, should remain in abusive situations for the sake of children. And of course, there are plenty of examples of single parents raising their children up to be successful adults. But these represent exceptions, not the rule. As a rule, children fare better in two parent homes. We should not hold exceptions as proof that women do not need husbands. And children do not need male guidance. If given the choice, we should always seek to provide children with the head start that comes from being raised in a healthy two-parent environment. Black genocide, liberal support. In 1965, a man by the name of Daniel Patrick Moynihan made this terrible mistake of telling the truth. As the Assistant Secretary of Labor, he was asked to study black poverty. During the time when America had just formally acknowledged the wrongdoings of segregation, with this acknowledgement came the fashionable belief that black people could no longer be held responsible for anything. Every ill that had befallen our community from that point onward became viewed as a legacy of white supremacy. In essence, black Americans became blameless. So when Daniel Patrick Moynihan issued his study, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, and highlighted the collapse of black marriages in America as a contributing factor to black poverty, he was roundly condemned for victim blaming. It would take decades before experts agreed that everything he had reported was accurate. Also buried in his report was another data point that was likely to strike fear in the hearts of any racists who were intent on maintaining the status quo. Moynihan noted that black population was growing. Beginning in the 1950s, the black population grew at a rate of 2.4% per year compared to 1.7% for the total population, leading Moynihan to write, if this rate continues in 7 years, one American in 8 will be non-white. Efforts to control the black population had been in place since at least the 1920s, when fear began spreading around the nation that the preferred, more intelligent white race was becoming threatened by immigration. Popular eugenicists made the argument that it was necessary to make efforts to stop those who were deemed undesirable from reproducing. Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, who is today held as a hero for giving women greater control over when they bear children, was one such eugenicist. Sanger upheld the popular belief of her day that America needed to hinder those with unfavorable traits from reproducing. From 1939 to 1949, Sanger led the Negro Project, an initiative that was purported to combat poverty among Southern blacks by providing families planning, education, and access to birth control and contraceptives. Intentionally as she was, Sanger pushed to partner with black ministries, who she knew would be instrumental in gaining the trust of the people she was looking to help and might thereby conceal her true motives. The ministry's work is also important, and also he should be trained, perhaps by the Birth Control Federation of America, as to our ideas and the goal that we hope to reach, Sanger wrote by Dr. Clarence Gamble, another leader of the Negro Project. Sanger wrote to Dr. Clarence Gamble, another leader of the Negro Project. We do not want word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of the more rebellious members. While Sanger's appeal to the black community may have been about choice, the fact remains that she openly authored articles in support of applying a stern and rigid policy of sterilization. In an effort to ensure the country against future burdens of maintenance for numerous offspring, as many be born of feeble-minded parents, so in in great so ingratiated so ingratiated were her ideas with the racism of her time that she addressed Ku Klux Klan members to garner further support for her birth control measures. At the turn of the 20th century, the eugenicist sentiment became a growing movement in America. The list of those demands unfit included immigrants, the physically and mentally disabled, the impoverished, the stupid, and of course blacks. The practice of forced sterilization upon black women in the rural South was so common it became known as Mississippi appendectomies. Doctors would tell women that they needed to have their appendixes removed, but would instead rob them of their reproductive abilities. In 1921, Sanger founded the American Birth Control League, which would eventually become Planned Parenthood Federation of America, today the largest provider of abortions in the United States. And since 1973, when abortions became legal, black women have terminated far more pregnancies than women of any other race. According to 2016 data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, with 401 abortions per 1,000 live births, black women have the highest abortion ratio among racial groups, far higher than the 109 abortions per 1,000 live births of white women, despite representing just 13% of the United States female population. They make up nearly 40% of all abortions. What is more, research conducted by the Life Issues Institute found that 79% of abortion offering Planned Parenthood facilities are within walking distance of black or Hispanic neighborhoods, and 62% are near black neighborhoods. This data clearly speaks to the intentional targeting of the black community. Much in the same way that Margaret Sanger's Negro Project targeted poor black women in the South. Of course, this ugly truth regarding Sanger's legacy has been pardoned by liberals who continue to carry out her agenda, and with more than 19 million black babies having been aborted since 1973, one black pastor was right to warn that if the current trend of abortions in the black communities continues, by 2038 the black vote will be insignificant. According to a Pew Research report, the birth rate for blacks declined 29% between 1990 and 2010. It's no wonder Democrats have suddenly come out in support of mass illegal immigration, as a new victim class to carry their party will be needed in the near future. Democrats continue to champion abortion as reproductive health care, and in the same way that the welfare system supports to enable irresponsible behavior, so does the abortion industry. Except this time, parents can abandon the responsibility of taking care of their children while they're in the womb. Those who are most vocal about abortion and abortion laws are my Those who are most vocal about abortion and abortion laws are my white brothers and sisters, and many of them do not care about the plight of the poor, the plight of the immigrant, the plight of African Americans. Reverend Dr. Luke Bobo, an anti-abortion pastor from Kansas City, Missouri, told the New York Times. My argument here is, let us think about the entire lifespan of a person. Thinking about the entire lifespan of a person is a historical conservative position. It was President Reagan who cleverly remarked on the irony that every person who is for abortion has already been born. Hypocrisy, though, has come to define the left's various platforms. Is it not a wonder that the same party that claims that racism is at the core of black America ill routinely promotes the policies and ideologies that victimize black families the most. The same people who scream about black incarceration rates, economic disparities, and impoverished neighborhoods never lend their voices in attacks against the welfare system, which inspires all three. Similarly, it is not a wonder that the same people behind the Black Lives Matter campaign, the ones who claim to care about the unjust slaughter of blacks in the streets, refuse to acknowledge that today the most unsafe place for a black child is in its mother's womb. Indeed,